in the cold haze of an early morning inside a vast military hangar, where the echo of turbine tests trembled across the concrete floor and the scent of fuel lingered like an old memory. Everything felt routine, until a young, overconfident Captain Mercer stopped mid-stride, as his eyes landed on a quiet woman standing near a restricted aircraft, dressed in simple jeans and a black jacket, a tablet tucked under her arm, looking so unimportant, so ordinary, that he instantly labeled her as someone with no business being there. Without a moment of thought, the arrogance that comes from believing a uniform grants absolute authority pushed him forward, and he began questioning her sharply, firing accusations as if he caught an intruder, while she stood perfectly still, calm, almost sorrowful, as if she lived through storms much louder than his voice, as if she knew patience is sometimes the sharpest answer. Around them, the hangar staff slowed, whispers rising. Why is he talking to her? Like that? But Mercer didn't see their confusion. Didn't see the way they glanced at the tablet she held. Didn't notice the faint respect in the eyes of the retired chief watching from across the room. A respect born only when someone recognizes a legend. Because the truth, still hidden beneath her silence, was that the woman he was humiliating once flew missions whose reports were stamped and sealed in redacted ink, carried scars from operations the public would never hear about, and earned medals that even some commanders never touch. Yet she stood there, saying nothing, letting him talk, letting him assume, letting him expose a dangerous truth about human nature, that we judge by appearance, by clothing, by what we think we know, not realizing that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who carried the heaviest history. And this moment, this small, tense, ordinary-looking argument was about to unravel into a story that would remind everyone watching that arrogance is loud, but real greatness rarely needs to speak at all. She walked into the courthouse with the kind of quiet presence that did not demand attention, yet somehow stole it from every corner of the room. Her steps were slow, steady, and almost too deliberate for someone who appeared as ordinary as she did. A simple gray shawl draped over her shoulders, a small leather notebook clutched in her hand, and eyes that carried exhaustion beneath their calm. Most people looked at her and saw nothing more than a modest, aging woman who probably belonged in a waiting room, not standing at the center of public attention. She didn't look like someone whose story could shake a room full of strangers. But that is always a mistake people make, thinking that extraordinary lives come with extraordinary appearances, thinking that heroes come packaged in glory instead of dust. The bailiff barely glanced at her as he guided her to the defendant's table, and the prosecutor didn't even stand up when she arrived. To them, she was just another violation, another name on the day's long list. The courtroom buzzed with impatience. People wanted their cases called so they could leave. No one expected anything unusual. No one expected her. When the judge finally entered, stern cold, the kind of man who measured worth in efficiency and order, he glanced at her paperwork and immediately frowned, as if annoyed that something so insignificant had taken up space on his docket. He didn't even look at her when he spoke. His voice came down like a gavel before the gavel had even been lifted. "You are charged," he said, flipping to the file without interest, "with violating a municipal code. Unauthorized access to a restricted area." He paused, annoyed. "This is a serious offense," he added, though his tone made it clear he didn't actually believe it was serious, only that he wanted the courtroom to move faster. She did not respond, did not try to defend herself, did not raise her eyes. She simply stood there, hands gently folded over her notebook, as if she were listening to rain instead of judgment. A whisper passed through the gallery. People were curious, not about her innocence or guilt, but about her silence. Most defendants talked too much, made excuses, tried to justify themselves. But she stood there like a shadow that had accidentally wandered into sunlight. The prosecutor finally rose, clearing his throat, and began to describe the violation, though even he seemed slightly embarrassed by how trivial it sounded. She had been found in a sectioned-off wing of the city archives building late at night, a restricted wing, a place she wasn't permitted to enter. She had no ID that granted her access, no appointment, no authorization, and yet she had walked in calmly, searched through old boxes of files, and left just as quietly, until security stopped her. When they confronted her, she didn't run. She simply told them the truth. She needed something in those documents, something very important, something she had been looking for years. But she didn't say what. Even now, she didn't say what. The judge frowned again, tapping his pen in irritation. "Why, exactly?" he asked finally. "Were you in a restricted area?" She hesitated, not out of fear. It was something else, like she wasn't sure if the truth would matter to him. Or maybe she wasn't sure she wanted him to have it. When she finally spoke, Her voice was soft, steady, and far more composed than anyone expected. "Because I had reason to believe," she said, "that the only copy of something I lost a long time ago was kept there." The judge stared at her, unimpressed. "What exactly?" he asked. Her fingers tightened slightly over the edge of her notebook. "A letter," she said. "A letter written by someone who never came home." A murmur moved through the court. The judge tried to maintain his stone expression, but his eyes flickered, just for a second, with something human. Annoyance? Curiosity? It was hard to tell. But he quickly masked it with authority. "You broke a law," he said firmly. "Whatever you were looking for does not excuse that." She nodded once, as if she had already accepted this outcome before walking in. "Yes," she said softly, "I understand the law. But sometimes the law doesn't know when something is human instead of criminal." Her words were gentle, but they struck the courtroom with surprising force. People leaned forward. Phones stopped buzzing. Even the creaking fans above seemed to quiet down. The judge cleared his throat again, this time more cautiously. "And this letter, why was it so important?" She lifted her eyes for the first time, and that single motion changed everything. Her gaze held decades of weight. Pain that carved itself into patience, loss woven into resolve. She looked at the judge not with defiance, but with the stillness of someone who had buried more than most could imagine. "Because," she said softly, "it was the last thing my son wrote before he died, and I never got to read it." The room froze. The judge leaned back slightly, his stern posture faltering, but she continued before he could speak. He served in a humanitarian unit overseas. Not a soldier, a relief worker. He believed in helping people. He believed in kindness the way others believe in commandments. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. The steadiness itself was more devastating than tears. His convoy was ambushed. They tried to protect the civilians they were escorting, and he was killed. The letter was recovered from the site and archived by the city because it was part of a classified investigation. They said the case was sealed. They said the documents would not be released. She paused and gently tapped the notebook in her hand. "But I had been searching for that letter for 13 years. And when I could finally discover where it was kept, I went there. I didn't break in. The door was open. I simply walked in and began searching." She swallowed lightly. "I wasn't trying to steal anything. I wasn't trying to hide anything. I just wanted to know what my son tried to say to me before he died." The judge looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening, not in anger this time, but in restraint. Something was cracking beneath his rigid exterior, but he recovered, leaning forward again. "The archives when you entered contained sensitive material," he said quietly. "It doesn't matter if the door was open. You still violated protocol." She nodded again. "If you must punish me," she said, "I understand. I am not here to avoid consequences. I am here because something inside me refused to live another year without trying one last time." A long, heavy silence washed over the courtroom. The judge did not know what to do. His authority was being pulled in one direction, his humanity in another, and everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. Even the prosecutor lowered his eyes, suddenly uncomfortable with the argument he had prepared. But the judge pressed on, clinging procedure like a shield. "Do you have any evidence," he asked slowly, "that this letter exists?" Her hands trembled for the first time, not from fear, just from the memory of what she had endured. She opened the notebook she'd been holding, revealing a page written in neat handwriting. "This," she said softly, "is the transcript of the report they gave me when he died. It mentions a personal note recovered from the deceased, collected as evidence." She handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. The judge read it, and his expression shifted, layer by layer, from skepticism to understanding to something deeper, heavier. He closed the notebook, exhaled unsteady, then looked at her again. This time really looked at her, not as a defendant, but as a mother who had lived with a wound time refused to close. The judge tried to speak, but emotion caught in his throat. He coughed, straightened, pretending to adjust his robe. But the cracks were visible now. His facade of cold authority had softened into the helpless, human recognition that he was standing before someone who had suffered beyond the reach of his legal vocabulary. "I understand your pain," he said finally, but she shook her head gently. "No," she said, almost smiling. "You don't have to understand it. I just needed someone to hear it." And that simple sentence broke whatever remained of the judge's stern armor. He removed his glasses, set them on the bench, and rubbed the bridge of his nose with a long, weary breath. Then, unexpectedly, he asked her, "If I allowed access, if I made a formal request, would you want me to retrieve the letter for you?" The question struck the courtroom like thunder. People gasped. Even the prosecutor lifted his brows in shock. But she didn't react with excitement. She simply closed her notebook and said softly, "I would be grateful, Your Honor, more than you know." The judge nodded slowly, as if committing himself to a decision he never imagined making. "Your case will be dismissed," he said quietly. There was no criminal intent. Only a mother searching for a closure the system failed to give. A ripple of emotion swept through the room. The prosecutor said nothing. The spectators stared. The bailiff looked at the judge like he had never seen him before. But the judge wasn't finished. He stood, something judges rarely do during simple dismissals, and walked down from the bench, approaching her with an expression stripped of authority, replaced by sincerity. He extended her notebook. "I will personally ensure," he said, "that the letter is retrieved, and I will place it in your hand myself." Tears welled in her eyes for the first time, not because of the dismissal, but because someone had finally chosen humanity over procedure. She bowed her head slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." And at that moment, the entire courtroom seemed to shift, like every person present suddenly understood how often they overlooked the quiet, gentle figures in the world, how often they assumed ordinary faces held ordinary stories, how often they forgot that behind the smallest, softest people walked histories full of battles no one ever witnessed. The judge watched her leave the courtroom, her shoulders lighter than when she entered, and as the door closed behind her, he realized something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones whispered by the people we ignore. When she stepped out of the courthouse, the world suddenly felt a little gentler, a little quieter, as if the sky itself understood the weight she had carried for so long. She didn't smile, not fully. Grief doesn't disappear that easily. But there was a fullness in her chest that hadn't been there for years, a small, trembling breath of peace. For the first time since her son's death, she felt the ache inside her shift not vanish, but soften. Behind her, the judge watched from the window, realizing that justice is not always found in laws, but in the moments when we choose compassion over convenience, understanding over authority. He would keep his promise. He would find that letter. And when he placed it in her hands, she would finally touch the last words of the boy she raised, the man she lost. Sometimes life gives us answers we don't expect. Sometimes it gives us people who remind us that humanity still exists in the unlikeliest places. And sometimes, without warning, we are given exactly what our soul has begged for in silence. Her story wasn't about breaking rules. It was about breaking through years of forgotten pain and finally being seen.